I stepped out of the taxi, smoothing the front of my dress blues, the medals on my chest feeling heavier than usual. The quiet anticipation of finally being home after 6 months in a high-security zone was the only thing keeping me standing. But then, I looked up. Planted right in the middle of my perfectly mowed lawn was a sign in bold red letters. Sold. Behind it, my mother's heirlooms and my framed commendations were being tossed into a dumpster, like industrial waste. My father, Douglas, and my brother, Garrett, stood on the porch, smirking with beers in hand. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I adjusted the strap of my tactical bag and started walking up the driveway, my boots crunching on the gravel with a rhythm I'd perfected over a decade of service. My name is Hannah, and I'm 29 years old. In my line of work, high-level intelligence and logistics for special operations, you learn very quickly that the loudest person in the room is usually the most vulnerable. Panic is a luxury I couldn't afford while stationed in Okinawa, and I certainly wasn't going to spend it on these two parasites. As I closed the distance, I saw Douglas's eyes flicker. He expected a tantrum. He expected the hysterical daughter he could gaslight into submission. Instead, he got a ghost. I stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at them. The power dynamic was physically designed to make me feel small, but I'd never felt taller. Garrett got into some trouble, Douglas said, taking a swig of his beer as if discussing a minor fender bender. He owes the wrong people a lot of money. $300,000, to be exact. We had to act fast. We? I asked, my voice flat. I don't remember being part of the we that decided to liquidate my life and my mother's legacy. Family sacrifices for family, Hannah, he snapped. The old manipulation rolled off his tongue like scripture. You're single. You live in barracks half the time anyway. You don't need an estate on the Charleston coast. Your brother needed a lifeline. He spoke about my home like it was an inventory item, a line on a balance sheet he had the right to audit. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and now they were looking for a bailout. I looked past my father to my younger brother. Garrett didn't look like a man who had just been saved from a $300,000 debt. He looked well-fed and arrogant, a parasite who had finally consumed enough of the host to feel powerful. He raised his wrist to check the time, and the sunlight caught the heavy platinum face of a brand new Patek Philippe. It was flashy, expensive, and bought with the deposit on my sanctuary. It was legal, sis, Garrett chimed in with a smirk. Dad saved my life. You should be happy you could help. I signed a general power of attorney so you could maintain the property while I was deployed, I said, my eyes locking onto that watch. Not so you could loot my sanctuary while I was still breathing. Douglas dismissed me with a lazy wave of his hand. It's done. The buyer is signing the final transfer in 10 minutes. The money for the lenders is already wired. You can stay at a motel by the highway until you redeploy. It's not a big deal. I remained tactically silent. They took my silence for defeat. They didn't realize I wasn't processing a loss. I was calculating an extraction. In their minds, I was an asset to be harvested. In my mind, they were targets who had just entered a kill zone of their own making. I looked at the house behind them, the grey shingles catching the late afternoon light. I remembered the day I bought it. I was 22 years old, fresh off my first combat tour. I was clutching a check made up of 3 years of hazard pay and sleepless nights. That house wasn't just wood and drywall. It was the only place in the world where I didn't have to watch my back. I had renovated it with my own hands. I remember sanding the floors until my fingers bled. I remember painting the walls a soft grey that finally quieted the noise in my head. I remembered Douglas standing in this exact spot. Back then, he told me I was selfish for buying property when Garrett was struggling to make rent. They tried to make me feel guilty for having stability then. Now, they were punishing me for it. But they made a critical error in their assessment. They thought they had stripped me of my armor. They didn't realize that the house was just a building. The fortress was inside me, and they couldn't touch that. In my family, I had always been the designated shield. I was the one who was parentified at 12, making sure Garrett had lunch, and Douglas had his shirts ironed. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need attention, because I could handle things myself. People would say I was so responsible, but what they meant was I was useful. This was the invisible chain of being a survivor. For years, I lived in a prison without bars. It was built on the expectation that my needs were secondary to their failures. My father and brother treated my success like a community chest. They had the right to raid. They didn't see a person with a life and a future. They saw an inventory item they could liquidate to cover their bad investments. This property wasn't just a purchase. It was a specific devise from my late mother's will. She knew. She saw the way the wind was blowing even before the cancer took her. She left me this piece of the Charleston coast as a final act of protection, specifically naming it as my sanctuary. To Douglas and Garrett, her dying wish was just equity they could trade for a gambling fix. The air between us tasted like salt and betrayal. I looked at the dumpster again. My framed commendations, the ones I earned while they were sitting on this porch drinking my beer, were resting on top of a pile of trash. It was a visual representation of how they valued my service. To them, my life was something to be harvested. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years. And now, they were looking for a final bailout. I realized then that my silence over the years wasn't weakness. It was a tactical hold. It was the survival mechanism of a child who learned to hide her joy so it wouldn't be stolen. They thought they were the predators, and I was the prey. They had no idea that I had outgrown the role of the victim a long time ago. Standing there in my dress blues, I wasn't the daughter they could gaslight. I was the intelligence officer who had already mapped out the exit strategy. "Is the buyer here?" I asked, my voice as neutral as a situational report. "She's inside doing a final walkthrough," Douglas said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening rumble. "Don't you dare make a scene, Hannah. She paid cash. We need this deal to close." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that I usually reserved for enemy combatants. "I wouldn't dream of making a scene," I said, stepping onto the porch. "I just want to meet the new owner." The door opened before I could even reach for the handle, and a woman in a beige pantsuit stepped out. This was Tiffany. One look told me everything I needed to know about her operating procedures. She wasn't a family looking for a starter home to fill with memories. She was a predator. She had sharp eyes, an expensive manicure, and the kind of personality that scanned a room looking for profit margins instead of warmth. She held the deed in her hand like a weapon. "You must be the daughter," she said, her tone as dismissive as a discarded file. She didn't offer a handshake. "Your father told me you might stop by to cause trouble." "Look, honey, it's done. The papers are signed. The money is transferred. I need you off my property before I call the police." I glanced past her, into the hallway I had sanded and stained. Douglas was standing by the kitchen island, holding a bank receipt with trembling hands. His face was flushed with the kind of high that comes from dodging a bullet at someone else's expense. He looked up, saw me through the open door, and grinned a wide, triumphant expression that made my stomach turn. "It's over, Hannah," he called out, waving the paper trophy in the air. $1,300,000. $300,000 wired straight to the lenders to clear your brother's name. Garrett is clear. The rest is already in a secure account. You can't touch it. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't conflicted. He was proud. He honestly believed he had pulled off the heist of the century against his own child. And won. I looked at Douglas and Garrett, standing there in my living room, radiating a sudden, unearned authority. This was the power illusion of the empty wallet. Their confidence wasn't built on character or achievement. It was a hollow shell rented by spending my value. They only felt powerful because they were standing on a foundation they had stolen from me. In their world, being a patriarch was a position they thought they could buy with my equity. They didn't realize that without my assets to prop them up, they had no internal strength to stand on. Their status was a temporary lease, and I was about to terminate it. "You wired the full amount?" I asked Tiffany, ignoring my father's gloating. $1,300,000, she said, checking her watch with an air of finality. Cash. It cleared 10 minutes ago. Now, seriously, get off my porch before I make good on that threat to call the authorities. I didn't move. I let the silence stretch, watching Douglas's celebration and Tiffany's impatience. The trap was set. The bait was taken, and the cage door was about to slam shut. I reached into the inside pocket of my uniform jacket. In my line of work as a high-security intelligence analyst, we don't just plan for the mission, we plan for the potential of betrayal. I didn't need a tactical squad or heavy reinforcements to end this engagement. I just needed the mother's seal. I pulled out a certified copy of a deed transfer, the paper crisp and cold against my skin. I didn't look at Douglas with a daughter's hurt anymore. I looked at him like a high-value target who had just walked into a surveillance trap. You really should have waited for the title search, I said to Tiffany. Her predatory smile twitched, her eyes flicking nervously to the document in my hand. She scoffed and told me she buys properties for cash all the time to beat the market, skipping the red tape because she thinks her greed makes her faster than the law. She was certain she was the smartest person on this porch. I let her enjoy that certainty for exactly 3 seconds before I shifted the atmosphere. I unfolded the document and held it up so the late afternoon sun hit the official notary stamp. This was dated and recorded 48 hours before I deployed to Okinawa. I explained it to her in the same flat, clinical tone I used for high-level intelligence briefs. Douglas has a general power of attorney, I stated. It allows him to act on behalf of Hannah as an individual. But Hannah, the individual, doesn't own this estate on the Charleston coast anymore. I shifted my gaze to my father, who had frozen in the kitchen. 6 months ago, I transferred the title of this entire property into the Hannah Revocable Living Trust. My father is not a trustee. He has zero authority over any assets held within that trust. He cannot liquidate, sell, or even paint a wall of something he doesn't legally control. He can't sell what he doesn't own. I watched Tiffany snatch the paper from my hand. Her eyes raced across the legal citations and the trust seal, and the colour vanished from her face so quickly, I thought she might collapse on the steps. The deed she held, the one she had just wired $1,300,000 for, was legally worthless. It wasn't a transaction. It was a forgery. Douglas scrambled to the door, his face twisted with the kind of panic that only finds a man when his lies run out of room. He screamed that he had the power of attorney, that it was right there in his hand, and that he had full authority. "Read the fine print, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his hysterics like glass. "It covers medical emergencies and personal checking accounts. It does not touch assets held in a separate legal entity like a revocable trust. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a federal officer witnessing a crime. You just sold a house you don't own," I said to him. "And you sold it to a woman who just realized her bank account is $1,300,000 lighter because of your fraud." The air went dead. The celebration in the kitchen didn't just stop. It evaporated into a vacuum of terror. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was an active crime scene, and I was the one who had just turned on the lights. Tiffany's face went from a deathly pale to a deep, bruising violet in a matter of seconds. The composure she had worn like a tailored suit was shredded, leaving only the raw, frantic energy of a wounded animal. She wasn't an investor anymore. She was a casualty, realizing she had been lured into a tactical kill zone by someone she had dismissed as just a daughter. Her eyes snapped to Douglas, who was now leaning heavily against my kitchen island, his hands shaking so violently that the bank receipt, his trophy of betrayal, fluttered uselessly to the floor. "Give me my money back," Tiffany hissed. Her voice had lost its dismissive edge, replaced by the low, guttural growl of a predator who realized it was the one being hunted. "Reverse the wire, Douglas. Do it right now." I watched the scene unfold with the detached interest of an intelligence officer reviewing surveillance footage. I felt no pity for either of them. Tiffany had tried to skip the red tape of a title search to exploit what she thought was a distressed situation. And my father had tried to liquidate my life and my mother's legacy to fund a parasite's failures. They were two predators who had finally bitten into each other. I can't," Douglas stammered. The high he'd been riding from his perceived win was gone, replaced by a grey, sickly sweat that matted his hair. The money is already transferred. It's out of my hands. Tiffany stepped fully into the house, her expensive heels clicking like gunshots on the hardwood floor I had sanded with my own bleeding fingers years ago. She grabbed Douglas by the collar of his shirt, forcing him to look at her. What do you mean you can't? $1,300,000? Reverse the wire transfer. I already sent the $300,000 for Garrett. Douglas screamed, the truth finally tearing out of him like a jagged confession. The lenders took it. They've already closed the books. I can't get it back. It's gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Garrett, who had been lazily admiring the platinum face of his new Patek Philippe, finally looked up, his arrogance evaporating into pure panic. He realized then that the lifeline his father had stolen for him was actually a federal noose. I didn't move from the doorway. I didn't need to. I explained the reality of their situation to Tiffany in the same clinical tone I used for high-level situational reports. It's not just a civil property dispute anymore, I stated. By signing my name on that sale contract, he committed forgery. And since he wired that $1,300,000 across state lines based on those fraudulent documents, this is now an active case of federal wire fraud. Tiffany let go of my father as if his very skin were poisonous. She didn't look at him with greed anymore. She looked at him with the pure, unadulterated fury of a woman who just realized she had been conned out of over $1 million. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers moving with lethal speed. I want to report a fraud in progress, she said into the phone, her voice cold and vibrating with rage. Significant theft. Over $1 million. Yes, the perpetrator is still here. His name is Douglas. I watched my father's eyes go vacant. He realized then that the cage door hadn't just closed. It had been welded shut by the very trust documents I had recorded. 48 hours before deployment. They had wanted quick cash and easy targets. Instead, they had walked straight into a minefield I had laid months ago. And now, there was nowhere left to run. The sirens outside were no longer a distant hum. They were a deafening reality. Red and blue lights flooded through the windows of the home I had built, strobing against the soft grey walls that now seemed to witness the final death of my family. I didn't move as 3 Charleston police cruisers screeched to a halt in my driveway. I just watched the light show dance across my father's vacant, terrified eyes. Douglas's panic hardened into the white-hot indignation of a narcissist who had just been exposed in front of an audience. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice cracking like dry wood. You did this, he spat. You stood there and watched me sign those papers. You let me wire that money. You set me up. I gave you a choice, I said, leaning against the doorframe with my arms crossed. I asked you if you wanted to tell me the truth. You chose to lie. You chose to double down. I didn't sign those papers, Douglas. I didn't wire that $1,300,000 to a criminal enterprise. You did. He roared, pacing the kitchen like a trapped animal. But he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking out the open front door, where our neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the yelling. That was the real injury. It wasn't the looming prison sentence that terrified him. It was the total destruction of his carefully curated image as the benevolent patriarch. You wanted to humiliate me, he yelled. You wanted your neighbors to see this. You wanted to make your own father look like a criminal. You are a criminal, I corrected him, my voice as cold and sharp as a bayonet. I just turned on the lights. I didn't trick you, Douglas. I protected myself. If my safety feels like a trap to you, that says everything about who you really are. As the officers entered the house, the rage drained from my father, replaced by a pathetic, hollow pleading. Hannah, he whispered, stepping toward me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. You can stop this. I'm your father. I looked at him, truly looked at him for the last time. You stopped being my father the second you treated me like a bank account to be liquidated, I said. The officers moved in, and the metallic click of the handcuffs was the most honest sound I had heard in this house in years. He didn't resist. He just went limp as he was led past the neighbors he had spent decades trying to impress. I thought the engagement was over, until Garrett blocked my path to the door. He wasn't smirking anymore, but he held his phone up like a shield. On the screen was a drafted email to my division's Inspector General. "You think you won?" he hissed. "I'll hit send. I'll accuse you of selling stolen military equipment, fake invoices, a forged bank transfer. One accusation like this, and your security clearance is gone. Drop the charges against Dad and sign the house over to me, or I destroy your career." I didn't beg. I didn't even flinch. I just laughed. A short, clinical sound. "Go ahead," I said. "Send it. My finances are audited every month by the department. Your fake documents don't match any federal records, Garrett. If you send that, you aren't exposing me. You're confessing to a federal crime." His phone dropped from his hand, hitting the hardwood with a dull thud. The arrogance was replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed panic. I raised my hand to the officers who were already leading my father out. "He just attempted extortion with falsified military documents," I told them. "I want to press charges." They cuffed him too. His screams that it was just a joke echoing through the quiet evening. I didn't watch them put him in the car. I didn't need to. The target had been neutralized. The threat was removed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't anyone's shield. I stood on my porch until the taillights of the last police cruiser disappeared around the curve of the driveway. The Charleston coast was quiet again, the only sound being the rhythmic, tactical crashing of the waves against the shore. I walked down to the lawn, gripped the post of that bright red sold sign, and wrenched it out of the dirt with everything I had. I threw it into the trash on top of the dumpster, right where my mother's heirlooms had been sitting just 20 minutes ago. I walked back inside my fortress and went straight to the security panel by the front door. I cleared the old settings, the ones Douglas had used to violate my sanctuary while I was 6 months away in a high security zone. I entered a new sequence, one that only I would ever know, and one clean, high-pitched beep confirmed the change. That sound was the first real peace I had felt in nearly a decade of service. This wasn't just a win in a property dispute. It was the final accounting of a long overdrawn debt. For 29 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a family, footing the bill for their failures, and treating my own stability as if it were a subscription I was required to renew for their benefit. I realize now that my compassion was a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and this outcome wasn't revenge. It was simply justice taking its natural course. Douglas and Garrett were never really my family. They were parasites who shared my last name and tried to liquidate my future while I was 48 hours from deployment. Letting go of bloodlines isn't an act of cruelty. It is a necessary revolution for anyone who has ever been treated as an inventory item by the people who were supposed to be their shield. I have finally stopped asking for permission to exist and started granting it to myself. I am no longer anyone's bailout or their bank account. Inside, the house was empty and quiet, exactly how a sanctuary should be. I wasn't happy yet, but I was safe. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. If you've ever had to become the villain in someone else's story just to survive, hit that share button and tell us your story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice.